Good afternoon and welcome to today's session. We're talking about the voter suppression efforts at the Arizona State Capitol. Arizona under attack. What are we going to do about it? Who's behind it? And how can we move forward and make sure that our voices are heard at the state capitol and beyond? My name is Liz Salazar. I'm Arizona Policy Advisor for UnidosUS Action Fund. And I am coming to you today from my office here in North Phoenix. And I'm very excited about all the panels that we have here today to talk to you about what's going on at the Capitol, explain a little bit about why these bills have flooded the legislative session and what we can do about it. First, I'm going to explain a little bit about UnidosUS Action Fund, which takes the really brave policy and advocacy of our sister organization, UnidosUS, and really puts them on the ground and makes them a political reality. To co-hosting the event with us, we have Arizona Advocacy Network. So I'd like to introduce our co-host from Arizona Advocacy Network, which is Paulette Zinzun. She is the Deputy Legislative and Policy Director for Arizona Advocacy Network. She's been engaged in the Arizona political landscape since 2017 with experiences ranging between the city, state, and federal levels of government. In addition to her background in advocacy and the organizing. Good afternoon, Paulette.
Hi, Liz. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone who is joining us and watching from home or from their offices. I'd love to introduce, and it's an honor to introduce Recorder Cázares-Kelly. A little bit about her. Gabriella Cázares-Kelly is the current Pima County Recorder. She leads an office that oversees voter registration, early voting, and document recording for the county. She is a proud union dues-paying former Red for Ed public school educator and community organizer, and a member of the Tohono O'odham Nation. She was inspired to run for office after encountering many systemic barriers that were preventing people from simply getting registered to vote. She is the first Native American to hold an elected Pima County office and the third Native American to hold a county-level office in the state of Arizona.
Gabriella Cázares-Kelly, Good day. My name is Gabriella Cázares-Kelly. I'm from the communities of Bisinmo'o and Kupk, which are located on the Tohono Nation, which is right here in beautiful Pima County, which I have the pleasure of serving now as the Pima County Recorder. I was asked today to speak about voter suppression and some of the tactics that are going on in our state. And I think it's really important to take two things into consideration. Number one, we are seeing this current attack unfolding right here in Arizona. It is making national headlines. We are seeing historic numbers of anti-voter bills being introduced into the state legislature. But what I always like to remind people is that although we're seeing this right now, Arizona has a long history. The United States has a long history of voter suppression that dates back hundreds and hundreds of years, which is rooted in white supremacy and rooted in a way to exclude working people, working folks, everyday people. And I think that that's really important to discuss. In my family, as we moved towards the centennial, 2020 was a centennial for women's suffrage and women having the right to vote. But in my family, it was very glaring that didn't include me. I often share that my grandmother, who was born in 1918, her name was Catherine Jose Maria, she was not a part of that history because she didn't become a part of the United States as a citizen until 1924. When Native Americans were finally made citizens. But it wasn't until 1948, when two World War II veterans came back from the war, that they tried to register to vote. They were denied. They sued the state of Arizona. And in 1948, when my grandmother was 30 years old, did she finally win the ability to simply register to vote. As we know, that didn't protect her from the ability to cast a ballot, and she could be turned away. She could be discriminated against. She could be subject to a literacy test or misinformation. And it wasn't until the civil rights movement, people protesting, people taking action, that paved the way for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected her right to vote. But my grandmother didn't speak English and wouldn't have protections until the late 1970s. And so when we talk about this, when we talk about who is participating in our elections and who isn't, there's a lot of finger pointing that goes along with that. But we have to recognize that not only was the system not designed for us, it was designed to keep us out, and that our voices are so important that it has been suppressed. And we continue to see this with these legislation that attack working people, that attack college students, young people, Latino communities, Native American communities. And it's a continuation of that. And so as we move towards the history and what's currently happening, we have to recognize and take into account that we are not all starting from the same starting line, and that some of us have not had the right nor the privilege of participating in this way that we need our community to be participating. And so all of these efforts that all of these groups are doing to get in front of community members, to help them connect their vote to their voice and to the community and what is happening and the needs of their community, all of those little things that are happening are going to change how we're represented as a whole. And so I thank you for allowing me to share with you all for a little bit to kick off this important discussion with amazing community leaders. And it's really amazing to see so many Latina women who are taking the stage today. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Recorder Cázares-Kelly, and thank you, Paulette Zinzun, for your work and for Arizona Advocacy Network co-hosting this event with UnidosUS Action Fund. And we'll be hearing a lot more from you later. I'm really excited to hear all about your expertise in the bills that are in the state legislature. So I want to welcome the rest of our panelists to the stage. We have Francisca Gil from Our Voice, Our Vote, Arizona. She is the political director. Hello, Francisca. We have Gina Mendez, the organizing manager at Living United for Change in Arizona, better known as LUCHA. And we also have Beth Lewis, who is the co-executive director of Save Our Schools Network. Thank you all so much for being here. So let's go ahead and start this conversation. First, for some of our audience members that are watching, I think it's important to set the stage a little bit about what happened in the last election. There was a lot of eyes on Arizona. There was a lot of speculation about what might happen as far as the state legislature, who is going to get power, and what LDs might flip over. And so when you look back and look at these hotly contested races, some of the results were really surprising. We ended up with a state legislature that, despite these razor-thin margins, is actually more conservative than one would think if you're just looking at it on paper. We definitely lost some of those moderate Republicans and some of those workhorses who sort of communicated between these two caucuses, carried a lot of bills, and were great partners to many of us. And so this change in the state legislature has definitely made some things more difficult. So with that, I'm going to start with Gina. Can you tell us a bit about the work that led up to November 2020 for your organization and what the results were?
Yeah, I mean, leading up to 2020, I know so many things happen. And Gabriella mentioned like the years, generations of voter suppression and problematic like bills that were happening in Arizona, right? Even alone for us, I still remember when SB 1070 happened here in Arizona, right? It was a really dark moment in Arizona's history where people were being separated, like families were being separated, people were being deported, and just so many things were not adding up, right? And on top of that, it really took community members to start organizing and to really say enough is enough, right? Really thinking about the different issues happening in Arizona and connecting it to voting. I myself, I wasn't involved in movement until 2016. And I remember, being a student at ASU and someone coming and talking to my group. I was part of a club at ASU, and they were talking to us about increasing the minimum wages. And even then, I didn't really understand how increasing the minimum wages was connected to voting. And so I had to learn that. Right. And at the moment, right, LUCHA was fighting, with this ballot initiative to make sure that Prop 206 was passed, and we had higher wages for folks here in Arizona. And so I then connected to that. My mom is a minimum wage worker. She worked 2 jobs. And as I was out there, I knew that I needed not to just to talk about voting, but to talk about the different issues happening in Arizona, the lack of school funding, the over, criminalization of Black and Brown and Indigenous folks in Arizona, the different things that were happening. And so really, it started with the organizing, going out into the community, really connecting the issues, regardless if it was healthcare, immigration, incarceration, and centering it around civic engagement and making sure our communities were participating, right? And so we know that those that are closest to the problems are closest to the solution. And so it took years of community members ensuring that, one, our folks were included. So going out and registering thousands of people to vote, and organizing around it. Doing political education, even within the work that we do at LUCHA, we going to different high schools, colleges, and bringing moms and dads to our spaces to learn about white supremacy, to learn about patriarchy, to learn about these different systems, and seeing how it connects to why am I still living in poverty, right? Why do I not have health insurance? And how can I actually create proactive solutions around this? And that took us making sure that those in our families who were eligible to vote got registered to vote, and making sure that they actually went out to go and vote. So it was a lot of being out in the community, reminding our folks, making sure they participated. And although we didn't get all of the wins we needed, that's why we need to invest more in community organizations. Where are those communities that we didn't necessarily flip? How can we start organizing and start connecting the issues that are deep to our hearts and connected to voting? And so prior to this election, we know back in 2016, Sheriff Joe Arpaio was someone who was terrorizing our community. We know that, they were trying to pass voucher programs to take away money from our schools. And so it took a lot of organizing in different communities. This past year, we were out in Coconino and Flagstaff, where we know that some of the representatives not too long ago tried to pass a bill where they wanted to lower the wages for youth, pay them just a little bit over $7.25. And I remember, as some of the folks in office were saying, well, high school students and college students don't need money. They don't need that much money. They don't have bills to pay. Well, it took us going out to Coconino and making sure that we were talking to those students and organizing with those students to say, actually, no, that's not accurate. We need money. and also connecting the different issues, whether it's climate, whether it's education, incarceration, to making sure that our communities were participating.
Thanks, Gina, for giving a lot of the background and context for what's been happening in Arizona, not just in the past few months, but what's really been happening here in the past 10 years. And really, when we look at what Recorder Cázares-Kelly is talking about, we're talking about hundreds of years of fighting against a system that was created to disenfranchise certain people. I'm interested in any of the panelists can respond to this to talk about, when explaining how power dynamics are at the state legislature, even though we have those razor-thin margins, what do power dynamics look like when one party controls both houses and the governor's seat? And anybody feel free to jump in.
I can kind of share this a little bit. First of all, when we talk about that, like those power moves, right? What happened this legislative cycle in particular, normally there's about 50 to 60 election-related bills that are dropped in any cycle. Last time there was about 80. This time there was around 135. And that means like 10 bills that are maybe 10 pages, 15 pages, 20 pages long, which all need to be read, all need to have a legal lens on them, all need to have research and, what are the implications? How is this going to impact voters? How is this going to impact our administration? How much money is this going to cost? Well, there's a lot that people need to take a look at. And so what was happening was 20 bills were being dropped at a time and nobody could read them. And so people like the recorder's offices, mine is the second largest in the state, but there are some recorder's offices that only have 3 or 4 employees. It's very small. And so that overwhelming tactic, and it was a tactic, it's very important to recognize, that was a tactic so that nobody could meaningfully engage in the laws that are being proposed. Nobody could speak out about it. Nobody could bring attention to it because we were stuck reading so many bills at one time. So then it goes into committees. And if you have, Republican in charge of which bills get heard, which ones are going to continue on in the process, and who gets to speak or doesn't get to speak. So I was invited to testify just last week about a bill. I had Senate Bill 1713, I believe, and which adds requirements for ballots. The time I was given 1 minute to talk about why or how this would impact my office. And then when I was questioned by state legislators, my time was cut. And they're like, we have 3 more people. We're going to cut it down. 16 people showed up to talk about how this bill is going to be harmful. We're only going to listen to 3. And so the conversation is cut short and there's nothing that can happen there. And so it is really frustrating. It is a very frustrating power dynamic that feels impenetrable at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Whoever controls the House, whoever controls the Senate, so the Speaker of the House, President, the Senate have a lot of control over what bills get heard, what even shows up in committee, how many people can testify, how much time you have to testify. We've seen some really grotesque things happen at the state capitol when it comes to regular citizens and advocates like yourselves making the time to testify and talk about how these will affect their lives and then being completely dismissed or disrespected by the people that are there to serve us. It's been extremely disappointing. Unfortunately, sometimes not surprising. So I'm going to turn over to Paulette to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the bills that are most pressing right now. Like the recorder said, there were dozens upon dozens. It was hard to keep track, but there are a few that are really pressing in this moment. It's important to note that Arizona voter turnout in the last election was 8%. And the overwhelming majority of Arizonans use what's called the permanent early voting list, or voting by mail, to cast their ballot. Everything from president to your county superintendent. So Paulette, can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on with PEVL and maybe some of the other bills that we're seeing at the Capitol?
Yeah, this session has been a ride, quite the ride. This session, we saw a great quantity of bills introduced, just like Recorder Cázares-Kelly just mentioned. They dropped about 40 plus bills. And all of these bills that were introduced tried to constrain democracy. And as bills were getting filed this year, we saw more in terms of volume and the severity of what's being proposed. To touch on a few bills, SB 1485, sponsored by Senator Michelle Ugenti-Rita, would remove the permanent out of the permanent early voter list and would purge thousands of voters from the PEVL if they don't participate in 2 consecutive primary and general elections. So this makes it harder for infrequent early voters to vote early and ignores the reality reflected in the data that many eligible registered voters simply choose not to participate in every election. Other bills that have been on our radar, sponsored by Senator J.D. Mesnard, are SB 1106 and SB 1713. SB 1106 creates new ways to remove eligible voters from the rolls and adds new criminal penalties for unsuspecting voters. SB 1713 creates new voter ID rules for voting by mail, such as requiring a voter's date of birth in addition to their driver's license number or voter registration number. So just to make it clear to everyone who is watching us today, what we're seeing here are intensified voting laws after President Trump's false claims of fraud in the 2020 election, and Republican lawmakers using these baseless conspiracy theories to suppress the right to vote. We saw that Democrats outperformed Republicans during early voting, and now Republicans are attacking the vote by mail list to prevent eligible voters from voting. And they continue to push this dangerous narrative that undermines the integrity of our elections. And just to put it out there and so that folks know, SB 1485, SB 1106, and SB 1713 all create additional barriers to early voting, and they are harmful to communities of color, to younger voters, to low-income voters. I can provide some of the impacts that these bills will have on specific communities. I know that in my community, early voting has increased the chances for folks to vote, but I'll open it up to others in case they want to share their thoughts on this. It's my 3rd session at the legislature, and I feel the difference compared to previous sessions on the number of bills and false narratives to suppress voters in Arizona.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from other panelists about what feels different this session, and talk a little bit more about this false narrative that something went wrong in Arizona with our elections and somehow it's invalid.
Yeah, I can jump in. I was very devastated after we were not able to flip the legislature to a pro-public education legislature in November, and to ensure a better balance of power. When looking across the states, we work with a lot of other groups in the U.S. We realized that Arizona was actually one of only 3 states to gain a seat for the Democrats. And so it's very interesting to look across the United States and realize that all of the state legislatures really took a shellacking, especially in terms of the things that matter to people, right? Policies around public education and around voting rights and women's rights. So we're seeing this assault all across the country. In terms of what's different here in Arizona this year, we're seeing, an onslaught of bills that are attacks on public education. Since I'm with Save Our Schools Arizona, we work very closely to watch all of those bills. And it's been pretty horrifying to see sort of this ironic issue that the folks who are pushing voter suppression bills are the same ones that are trying to dismantle public education, right? The schools that serve the vast majority of our students and our children of color. And they're using this sort of civil rights narrative, this rhetoric around the fact that vouchers will somehow help everybody and, save our students of color, when in fact it's very obvious from these attacks on voting rights that these lawmakers who are pushing these policies do not care about communities of color, and they do not care about our kids whatsoever.
Yeah, it's been really unfortunate to see some of those same old issues that Arizonans have been very loud about in the past, for example, vouchers. And saying we don't want these, just continue to come back, and it's all interconnected. None of these issues exist in a vacuum. Francisca, was there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I would like to add something, because these behaviors that are happening at the legislature, like not allowing people to speak or testify or cutting them off, it is not new. I remember being at the legislature on February 18th, 2020. It was a very stressful day for me because it was my first time testifying in a House Bill 2304. And I waited 6.5 hours. I followed the protocol. I waited for everybody to speak patiently. I was hungry, thirsty. And as a new, my second time, of course, I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen. So I was so excited of participating in this democracy, in the great democracy, another level. And so it was very hard for me to see that after waiting and following the protocol, I wasn't allowed to participate and allowed to speak. So what we see now is the escalation. We are seeing more, and it is scary and it's very concerning, because I am originally from Venezuela, so have seen these patterns. We no longer have democracy in Venezuela, and so now as a U.S. citizen, it is alarming to me when I see on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol, one of our most patriotic represented place, people an insurrection. So it is alarming. Our democracy is at risk, and now you see at the legislature all this, so many bills attacking and creating barriers for us to vote, and it is concerning, and we need as a community to come together to stop this. To stop this, because this is keeping this is hurting our communities, the Black and Brown communities, the Native American community, the LGBTQ community, the low-income voters, and our democracy is at risk right now. I believe so. With my background,
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Francisca. I think there's no hyperbole here, and it may sound like we're being dramatic, but we're certainly not. We should all be screaming from the mountaintops about the multitude of ways that our voices are being stifled, not only in Arizona but in other states. These are calculated attacks and retaliation for certain outcomes of the 2020 election. And these people are very smart and very savvy, know the system very well, and we have to be just as calculated, smart, savvy, and just as loud and demanding about our voice. I'd like to turn over to Beth to talk a little bit more about how important it is to protect the process of citizens' initiatives. And I think it's a particularly salient issue for Save Our Schools Arizona and Save Our Schools Network, because of how you came to be a part of the education advocacy community and the huge impact you've had in such a short time, because regular citizens got involved they got civically engaged.
Yeah, Arizona has, a very special piece of its constitution that allows citizens to set up initiatives by collecting signatures or to refer a bill to the ballot that citizens really don't approve of. And I think it's a beautiful thing. We've seen in the last 3.5 years, we've had 2 of those. So we had Prop 305, which was a referral of, for education, a referral of the voucher program. And then we had Proposition 208, which was a citizens initiative. And just to remind everybody, those signatures were collected during a pandemic by teachers and parents who wanted to support our classrooms. I find it very interesting how angry our lawmakers are, the ones in power right now, about Proposition 208. There are direct attacks on Prop 208. Right now, there's a bill 1783, which is a massive tax cut that's intended to offset Proposition 208. The JLBC, which is like the budget committee, discusses that fact. And yet in committee, when it was being discussed, Chairwoman Bullock forbade any mention of Proposition 208. And to go back to what Francisco was saying and Gabriella, there were thousands of people logged in on the request to speak system against this bill. And yet when it came time, they said 3 people on each side. And Chairwoman Bullock got so upset last week that she actually shut that down and didn't even allow 2 people or 3 people from the education world to speak. And those were teachers who were just trying to give testimony about what was going on in their classrooms and why Prop 208 funds were so necessary. And I was really fascinated to watch the video. Representative Cano, in his explanation of his vote, asked Chairwoman Bullock, he said, "What are you so afraid of? Letting people speak." And I think those words are really powerful. And I think that's the question we all really need to ask. And we need to tell our lawmakers, if your policies do not match what the people want, you need to change the policies instead of silencing the people.
Absolutely. Erin has spoken again and again about how much they support public education. Year after year, communities passing bonds and overrides to pay for things that bonds and overrides weren't meant to pay for, right? And taxing themselves and telling the state legislature, we don't want vouchers, passing Prop 208 with what seemed insurmountable challenge of COVID-19. And here we are. They are afraid. We can see that fear manifested through these many voter suppression efforts, through the attacks on 208. And it's unfortunate that they're afraid of the voices of Arizonans who have already rung very loud and clear on these issues. I'm interested to hear from other panelists on the power of citizens initiatives and ballot referrals and how that has affected the work that your organizations do. Well, we're feeling a little bit shy this morning. That's okay. There's so many that have been worked on. For example, LUCHA worked on the minimum wage, which is really important. And that was a lot of work. Gina, can you talk a little bit more about the work that goes on behind getting something like that to the ballot and then getting it passed?
Yeah, I mean, similar to Prop 208, in 2016, it took so much to go out and talk to community members about increasing wages, collect signatures, just to get it on the ballot, because some of our legislators weren't listening to us, right? And so even after that, it was a battle. Them trying to, do the most, and even in 2017, try to pass bills then to prevent that from happening. Really taking in consideration, like, okay, so folks are organizing, they're out there talking to voters. We need to do something. How do we go about this? Right. And that is exactly why they continue to try to pass legislation that wants to harm ballot initiatives to come. Right. And we've seen it with, as soon as we had Prop 206 and the voters speak out and say, yes, we need higher wages. The first thing that they tried to do during the legislative session in 2017 was trying to attack that. Try to with those proposed bills. And so we're seeing it again. And so they are scared of our community members organizing. They're scared of voters voting. And that is, again, why they continue to create, these bills to try to suppress that.
Thank you. I'd like to turn over to Francisca. We've talked a lot about several ways that our voices are being either stifled at the state legislature or they're in danger of being completely snuffed out. And for the average person, it's sometimes hard to keep track of all of it. It's hard to understand how it all plays together. And it's hard to understand how access to voting looks different for different people. Could you talk a little bit about how marginalized voices could be affected by these bills being passed by the state legislature?
You are cutting off a little bit, so I hope I can grasp your whole question. It is very sad and very concerning how all these bills create more barriers for low income, for our people, for communities, the Native community, the Black and Brown community. It is extremely sad when we see, for example, Senate Bill 1713 that introduced by Mesnar, that where the voter has to put not only their date of birth, but also driver's license or voter registration on the ballot in an affidavit, and the affidavit to be able to be concealed. You know, this creates more problems and more barriers to people, especially if you don't have a driver's license. We need to understand that 66,000 registered voters don't have a driver's license. And we need to think about all the mistakes that people can make when they have to write down numbers, driver's license, voter ID. What about if you do not have, like people that live outside Maricopa County, they do not have access to ways to look up at their VR's number online, for example. So all those barriers create more problems for people to participate. And we need to make our democracy stronger by allowing more people to be part of the voting process. So when we see more, what about if you don't have the money to buy, to get an ID, and like that, right? And for example, Senate Bill 1106. When we see this bill, for example, eliminates the requirements that counties take the necessary steps to contact the voter at the voter new resident when mail returned as undeliverable. So we need to pay attention to this bill. It's scary. What about if somebody writes on your ballot, on your mail, like you no longer live on that address, and it's sent back to the county, and you are pretty much purged, you're out, you're not allowed to participate on the democratic process. So we need to pay attention to what is happening in Arizona, and we need to make sure that we fight back and we educate our communities. I don't think our communities are aware. Like, I didn't know that people, that you're going to be sent in the mail some type of a notification, and and what if you don't see that notification? Personally, I was deactivated twice, and I still didn't know how I got deactivated. Thank God that I was able to speak English to begin with, and being able to make a phone call and trace and look for my ballot this past elections. I was looking for my ballot like a needle in a haystack, right? I went to the post office. I'm like, how did I get deactivated from April to June? And I was thankful that I was able to trace back and understand. But imagine that amount of time away from the family, time in the middle of a pandemic, time away from work, time, this is making Americans to work so hard to vote. Why are we doing this? And making people, especially Black and Brown communities, low-income communities, and the Native American communities, just making it hard for them to participate. I don't think that's fair. We need to educate our communities. We need to really, really understand what is happening here. These tactics are evil, really evil, because they are dismantling our democracy. and we really did, understand. And we need to understand the process, and we need to educate our communities.
I totally agree with you, Francisca, and I like that you talked about the impacts of SB 1713 and SB 1106, who, again, these bills, both of these bills are sponsored by Senator J.D. Mesnard. And just to chime in really quick about the impacts of SB 1485, sponsored by Senator Ugenti Rita, this would impact independent voters because they must take an additional step to vote in a primary election and are therefore less likely to vote in them. This also impacts Latinos and Native Americans because they tend to vote at some of the lowest rates during midterm election years, which may make them more susceptible to the Pebble Purge. Additionally, the notice requirement that SB 1485 has in the language only gives the voters 30 days to respond, which impacts rural Arizonans and, again, Native American voters that rely on post office boxes and may not check their mail frequently enough to respond to the notice within the 30 days that remain on the Pebble. And so, as we've talked about, when these bills are up in committee and we have folks from the communities who are directly impacted by these bills, we're limited. Our testimonies are limited. Maybe 1 to 2 persons can talk about the bills, but I think knowing who your legislator is and sending them an email, calling their office to make your voices heard is what is our way of taking action against these voter suppressing bills at the legislature.
Going back to some of the conversation regarding citizens initiatives, those petitions, we think about some of the legislation that's been passed to question the validity of signatures. It really impacts my office a lot. And, sometimes people make absent-minded mistakes when they're filling out these petitions. Maybe they have a very loopy signature that has, a Y that goes into the next line or something like that. Or maybe they put their the current date or, versus a birth date or, put in like just the echo. The double lines that indicate, oh yeah, my husband signed and he wrote the full address and then I'm going to sign, but my husband, it's right here. And so we see a lot of those types of, not errors, but time-saving things that people do to try to sign these petitions quickly, because it's usually, standing out on a sidewalk somewhere or passing a table somewhere. And I think that the reality of that is constantly under threat, and that legislation has been introduced to try to limit a lot of that before, and it continues, and it keeps coming up. Meanwhile, we have, and I'm blanking on the name of the signature verification system that we have statewide, where federal and state candidates can, whoever can chime in or throw it in the chat. It's driving me crazy. But we have that service, and we have the ability to be able to do that information, to participate in that way online. Otherwise, you're really just waiting. You're waiting to come into physical contact with somebody who is carrying a petition. And it's really subject to, like, if you're going to a public event, if you're going to see somebody in person, as opposed to, utilizing this very secure technology that we have at our fingertips and being able to expedite the process and have these very clean signatures that are verifiable, that you have to log in to access. And so I think that there are ways. The technology exists for us to improve these systems, but I think that it is very intentional because we want to discourage, or Arizona wants to discourage, citizens from seeking to resolve a problem in their community, such as education funding. Like, that is absolutely something that goes against what Arizona leadership right now is pushing. And so, that is a tactic to keep more of that legislation away and difficult. The number of signatures that you have to get and things like that just to get on the ballot, it's really incredible. It costs a lot of money. And because of that money and the requirement to inform people about that, not only to get the petition signed, a lot of photocopies are having to be made, hundreds of photocopies, thousands, but also the information, the literature, to educate our public on what that is going to correct. And so I think that's really significant also to be aware of, because that's something that continues to come up.
Thank you, Recorder. What I like about hearing from all these fantastic women is that we all have a different point of view as far as how these things may affect our community and our work, and hearing the way that it affects your county recorder and the staff, which may be as little as 2 or 3 people in that office, is a perspective that a lot of people don't think about. We've talked a lot about what are these voter suppression efforts, how they're interconnected with other things like education and other efforts going on in other states. So we want to close out with some calls to action. What are some actual things that everyday people can do to let their legislators know that they don't agree with these voter suppression tactics, and they want them to make sure that these bills don't pass through the legislature? So my call to action is going to be for to contact a few people who could be swing votes. So I grew up in the West Valley of Arizona, the far West Valley. So I'm going to call out Joel John in LD4, and I'm going to call out Representatives Dunn and Osborne in LD13. And those are examples of 3 people that you can pick up the phone and call if you're in 4 or 13 and say, hey, I heard about these voter suppression tactics. I'm really concerned about it. You can also email them. They're just regular people like you and me, and they have regular jobs and lives and families. And so don't feel intimidated to pick up the phone and call people like Joel John, Representative Dunn, Representative Osborne. I'm coming to you live from LD20. So somebody like Paul Boyer, who is also a classroom teacher, by the way, and should care about what's going on with our students. So I'm going to open up to the floor so that our panelists can talk about some concrete ways that you can make your voice heard on these issues.
As mentioned a little bit before we went into the impacts of the bills, on behalf of AZAN, we want to encourage people to keep up the pressure to tell Arizona House and Senate leaders to stop these anti-voter bills, to keep Arizonans' voting rights intact. I can drop the link on the chat to email your legislator. Let me include it here, and tell them that you are against these bills. They don't have to be, the legislators don't have to be in your district. You can reach out to the leaders on both chambers and use your voice and speak out against these bills.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think one of the most important things is do not believe the big lie. From my experience as a Venezuelan American, when you repeat a lie, fraud, people, when you repeat a lie multiple times, you have to be careful with that, because we do not have anything to support those lies, right? We have the best elections. People show up even though in the middle of a pandemic. So we need to educate our communities that this is a big lie. And those bills are feeding a big lie. And we need to protect, we need to be active, and we need to protect our voting rights. We need to protect our access to the ballot and the access to, to be able to give it, to be able, because our vote is our voice, right? So, and that means just get to your community, educate your communities, because they do not know. And then go and really, really connect with those legislators and just tell them what you need to fight for what you value. This is not for free. Many people before us fought for me as a woman to vote today.
And I'll jump in. So I just want to remind everybody that, voting suppression is never the end goal. The end goal is to pass legislation that harms our communities. And in Arizona, time after time, year after year, the legislation has been impacting our schools and our communities of color, our women, our LGBTQ students. And so I just want to remind everybody to use your voice, talk to your neighbors, tell them that right now in the legislature, the vote is being suppressed and Arizona voters are not being listened to, because Arizona voters passed Proposition 208 only 4 months ago, and 47 lawmakers are trying to overturn the will of 1.7 million Arizona voters. And 3 years ago, Proposition 305 was defeated, and Arizona lawmakers are doing the exact same thing by passing vouchers. And so I really do want to encourage people to sort of connect the dots that not only are they suppressing our vote, but they don't care about our past votes either. And that, it's not right for 47 people to have the ability to do such a thing, to dismiss our voice every single day. And you can call these lawmakers. I like that Liz is calling people out by name. Senator Boyer in LD20 is the sponsor of the voucher bill. So I definitely encourage you to reach out to him and remind him what voters have asked for. And I'll put that link in the chat.
Yeah, and I would say my call to action is to sign up to start volunteering with the organization. Like, start organizing. That's where it starts. It's not that hard to get connected with social justice organizations, to start learning about what is happening and start taking action. I mean, instead of, having our legislators try to, create these voter suppression bills, like, how can we start organizing and making sure we're looking at the state budget? How can we allocate funding to make sure that our youth, our high school students, or even our homeless communities have that ID just to vote, right? How can we start putting pressure on some of these folks that we know don't have our best interests in mind? So let's start organizing, because, again, some of these folks, they won by a little bit. It's only a matter of time till some of them are out of office. But before we make sure that, they get out, if we want them to get out of office, we need to first be informed, start organizing around in our communities, especially in those areas where, folks barely won, and making sure that we're represented. And let's start let's start doing, some protests and stuff. But it starts with getting connected to organizations, start organizing, think about issues that you care about and start connecting it to voting. And there's so many different works on here. Folks can easily get connected with us and sign up to volunteer with LUCHA. I can drop it in the link, but I would say that's the thing. Let's start organizing in our communities and making sure that our folks are activated and continue to participate.
Absolutely. And yes, we need to be thinking about running for office. Don't be intimidated by the complex nature and these big issues. If you have 5 minutes, or if you have 5 hours, or if you have a lifetime, you can do something to make a difference. So maybe it's just signing up for LUCHA's newsletter or Save Our Schools newsletter and just trying to keep up with what's going on. Maybe it's calling a legislator. Maybe it's emailing them. Maybe it's volunteering. Maybe it's talking to your tia or your dad or your cousin about what's going on and getting them involved in the process. There's something that you can do. Don't feel overwhelmed by this. Like I said, if you have 5 minutes or if you have a lifetime to fight, do something. We really appreciate you all joining us today. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. Thank you to Recorder Cázares-Kelly for your welcome remarks. And again, don't be intimidated by your legislators, and don't be intimidated by these issues. You can raise your voice. You have to raise your voice so that we can protect Arizona. We can protect the future of our kids and make sure that our state is the best place to live, learn, and thrive. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a great